Good evening, everyone. Tonight we will enter the world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets, a time when gas lamps flickered softly against the encroaching dusk, and the gravest mysteries often unfolded not in bustling cities, but behind the genteel facades of English country homes. We find ourselves in an era where reputation was paramount, and beneath the veneer of polite society, human passions, greed, jealousy, and long-held resentments simmered, ready to erupt. Our guide, as ever, will be a lady of formidable intellect and deceptively mild demeanor, who sees the darkest truths mirrored in the everyday occurrences of village life. So pull up a comfortable chair, perhaps with a cup of warm tea, and let your mind drift back to an age of elegance and enigma. Now let's start with the first chapter of The Curse of the Emerald Necklace. Chapter 1. The Arrival and the Whispers. The train, a huffing, steaming leviathan, deposited Miss Jane Marple onto the rather sparsely populated platform of Atherton Halt. A gentle breeze, redolent with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, greeted her, stirring the wisps of gray hair escaping from beneath her sensible straw hat. It was late spring in the year of our Lord 1922, and Atherton, a village Miss Marple had not visited in many years, seemed to have settled into a comfortable, if somewhat worn, tranquility. She had come to stay with her cousin Mabel, who had recently taken ill with a persistent chest complaint, and Miss Marple, ever the thoughtful relative, deemed it her duty to assist. As she stepped from the carriage, a young porter, no older than 16, rushed forward to assist with her luggage, a sturdy, well-traveled Gladstone bag, and a smaller, equally practical hat-box. "Welcome to Atherton, ma'am," he offered, his voice a pleasant, if unpolished, baritone. "Are you expected?" "Indeed, young man," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but clear, like the rustle of silk. "I am Miss Marple, on my way to Mrs. Henderson's, at Lavender Cottage." A flicker of recognition, quickly veiled, crossed the boy's face. "Ah, Mrs. Henderson. We're sorry to hear she's not been well. I'll get you a trap right away, miss." He hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to observe the sleepy station. It was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone, and a stranger, even one as unassuming as herself, was instantly a subject of polite, if unspoken, curiosity. She noticed a woman in a somewhat overwrought hat standing by the ticket booth, pretending to read a notice but clearly casting furtive glances in her direction. Miss Marple merely smiled faintly. Village life, she knew, was a rich tapestry of observation. The trap arrived swiftly, a sturdy pony and cart driven by a man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen a great deal. He greeted her with a respectful nod. "Morning, miss. To Lavender Cottage, you say? Mrs. Henderson will be pleased." As they began their gentle journey through the winding lanes, bordered by burgeoning hedgerows and fields of newly green wheat, Miss Marple noticed the subtle changes in the village. The old bakery had a new sign, and a quaint tea-room had sprung up where the blacksmith's forge once stood. Progress, she mused, was an inexorable force, even in the most steadfast of villages. "Much news in Atherton, Mr.?" she inquired, her voice pitched just right to invite conversation without demanding it. "Barnes, miss. Thomas Barnes, and not a great deal, usually," he replied, adjusting his reins. "Though the Ashworths up at the Manor, they've been stirring things a bit lately. Lady Ashworth, she's had that old emerald necklace brought out, the one they call the Serpent's Eye." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had taken from her bag, paused in mid-stitch. "Indeed? I remember hearing whispers about that necklace many years ago." "A rather unfortunate history, if I recall correctly," Mr. Barnes chuckled, a dry rustling sound. "Unfortunate's putting it mildly, miss. It's cursed, they say. Every time it sees the light of day, trouble follows. And Lady Ashworth, she's a proud woman, you know, doesn't hold with superstitions. But even she's had a bit of a turn, I hear. Just last week, her prize rose bushes, the crimson glory varietals she's so proud of, were all mysteriously blighted overnight. just shriveled up, black as coal. And then young Master Julian, the heir, he took a nasty tumble from his horse, broke his arm, poor lad, all since that necklace came out of the strong-room. Miss Marple merely hummed, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery. A blighted rose bush and a broken arm, hardly the stuff of dramatic curses, perhaps, but enough to set a village talking. She knew, however, that the initial ripple of misfortune often preceded a larger, more destructive wave. Human nature, she reflected, was far more predictable than any supposed supernatural curse. "And has the necklace been displayed yet, Mr. Barnes?" she asked, her voice light, as if making idle conversation. "Oh, yes, miss. Lady Ashworth wore it at the village fete last Saturday. Rather a grand affair it was, despite the gloomy weather. Shone like a beacon it did, even in the gray light." There was a moment, though, Mr. Barnes paused, his brow furrowed, when the sky went very dark indeed, and a sudden gust of wind nearly tore down the refreshment tent. Some folks said it was the curse, trying to snatch the necklace away, and then, well, the very next morning, one of the Manor's oldest peacocks, a magnificent bird they called Regal, was found dead by the ornamental pond. No marks on it, just dead. The vet couldn't explain it. A blighted bush, a broken arm, a blustery gust, and a dead peacock. The narrative of the curse was building, brick by unsettling brick. Miss Marple's eyes, though mild, held a glint of keen interest. She understood that sometimes the most mundane incidents, when strung together, painted a picture of something far more sinister. It was rarely the supernatural that caused such misfortunes, but rather the very human hand, guided by motives often cloaked in plain sight. As the trap turned onto the lane leading to Lavender Cottage, Miss Marple felt a familiar stir of anticipation. Atherton, it seemed, was not quite as tranquil as it appeared. The emerald necklace, she suspected, was merely a brightly glittering focal point for something far darker beneath the surface. Chapter 2. A glimpse of grandeur and unease. Mabel Henderson, though still a little weak, was delighted to have Miss Marple's company. Lavender Cottage, with its chintz-covered furniture and scent of dried herbs, offered a comforting haven. Yet, even within its walls, the whispers of the Ashworth emeralds found their way. Mrs. Henderson, a kindly woman with a penchant for harmless gossip, confirmed Mr. Barnes's account and added a few choice details, gleaned from her daily visits to the baker and the postmistress. "Poor Lady Ashworth," Mabel sighed one afternoon, stirring sugar into her tea. "She's so set on proving that necklace isn't cursed. Always wears it, even for casual dinners, I hear. But it does seem to attract trouble. Just yesterday the cook at the Manor, Mrs. Higgins, tripped on the cellar steps and sprained her ankle rather badly. And the very morning after the fete, when the peacock was found, one of the ancient oak trees in the Ashworth's park, a tree that had stood for centuries, suddenly split clean down the middle in a perfectly calm wind. No storm, mind you. It's all very unsettling." Miss Marple listened, her fingers steadily knitting a delicate lace doily. "And who lives at the Manor now, Mabel, besides Lady Ashworth, of course?" "Well, there's Lord Ashworth, naturally, though he's often away on business in London. Then Julian, the heir, you know, who broke his arm, and his sister, Miss Eleanor. A sweet, rather timid girl, but prone to nerves. And then there's Mr. Cedric Thorne, Lord Ashworth's nephew, a distant cousin, really, but he's taken up residence there for a while, helping with the estate accounts. And a new companion for Lady Ashworth, Miss Penelope Davies. She seems a bright, capable young woman, quite a contrast to Lady Ashworth's rather forceful personality." A few days later, a formal invitation arrived from Ashworth Manor. Lady Ashworth, determined to show off her resilience, or perhaps simply her magnificent jewels, was hosting a small gathering for local gentry and village notables. A little musical evening, the card read, to lift spirits. Miss Marple, persuaded by Mabel that it would be rude to refuse, accepted. The Manor, a grand ivy-clad edifice, loomed majestically as the trap delivered them up its long gravel. Drive. Inside, the drawing-room was a symphony of old money and subdued elegance. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors stared down from high walls, and the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and dried roses. Lady Ashworth, a formidable woman, with a hawk-like nose and an impressive coiffure, greeted her guests with an air of gracious authority. Around her neck, sparkling with an almost unnatural brilliance, was the Serpent's Eye emerald necklace. It was a truly magnificent piece, a cascade of deep green stones set in intricate gold, catching the light with every movement. Miss Marple observed the room, her eyes missing nothing. Lord Ashworth, a stout man with a florid face, stood by the fireplace, conversing loudly about hunting. Julian, his arm in a sling, looked rather bored, though he managed a polite smile for his mother's guests. Eleanor, pale and ethereal, hovered near the French windows, looking as if a sudden noise might make her shatter. Mr. Thorne, Lord Ashworth said. Nephew was a striking man with dark, intelligent eyes and an air of quiet efficiency. He seemed to be discreetly overseeing the staff, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Miss Davies, the companion, moved gracefully among the guests, her smile warm and genuine, though Miss Marple noted a fleeting look of anxiety in her eyes when she glanced at the necklace. During a lull in the conversation, as a young woman played a rather spirited sonata on the grand piano, a peculiar incident occurred. One of the footmen, carrying a tray of delicate sherry glasses, suddenly stumbled. The tray tilted precariously, and with a collective gasp from the guests, a crystal decanter of sherry, an heirloom piece no doubt, crashed to the polished parquet floor, shattering into countless glittering fragments. The footman, a young lad with a face as crimson as the spilled wine, looked utterly distraught. Lady Ashworth merely gave a tight, exasperated sigh. "Oh, do be careful, Robert. What on earth possessed you?" Lord Ashworth, however, looked rather pleased. "Curse strikes again, eh, my dear? Told you it would." He winked at a neighboring squire, as if to underscore his own prescience. But Miss Marple's gaze was not on the shattered decanter, nor on the distressed footman. Her eyes, as sharp as any needle, had caught something else. Just before the footman stumbled, she had seen Mr. Thorne standing quite close to the path the footman was taking, subtly shift his foot. It was barely perceptible, a mere fraction of an inch, but it was enough to catch the young man's heel. An accident? Or something more? And why, she wondered, would Mr. Thorne, the efficient and composed nephew, cause such a trivial disruption? The incident, minor as it was, added another unsettling layer to the unfolding mystery. The curse, she mused, seemed to have a surprisingly human touch. Chapter 3. The first curse manifests. The shattered decanter, while a minor inconvenience for Lady Ashworth, served only to fuel the village's growing conviction that the emerald necklace was indeed cursed. News of the incident traveled faster than a runaway horse through Atherton's lanes, embellishing itself with each retelling. "The very spirit of the manor is rebelling," Mrs. McGillicuddy's sister-in-law was heard to declare at the butcher's shop. Miss Marple, while attending to Mabel's herbal remedies, heard these accounts with a practiced ear. She understood that a communal belief in a curse could be a powerful tool, capable of explaining away a multitude of sins and conveniently diverting suspicion. Her mind, however, sought the human mechanism behind such supernatural occurrences. The subtle shift of Mr. Thorne's foot during the musical evening lingered in her thoughts, a tiny, almost insignificant detail, yet one that pricked at her intuition. 2 days after the Manor gathering, a far more significant misfortune befell the Ashworths. It was a Saturday morning, a bright, clear day, when the village awoke to the news that the Ashworth stables had suffered a devastating fire in the early hours. 2 of Lord Ashworth's prize-winning hunters, magnificent creatures he was preparing for the upcoming county show, had perished in the blaze. The stable-master, a gruff but devoted man named Old Jenkins, had barely escaped with his life. sustaining severe burns to his hands and face. The fire brigade from the nearest town had arrived quickly, but the old timber structure, dry as tinder, had been consumed with terrifying speed. The cause of the fire was officially deemed accidental, attributed to a faulty lantern left carelessly by a junior groom. However, the villagers, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination, saw only one explanation: the curse. "It's the necklace, I tell you," wailed Mrs. Henderson, clutching a trembling hand to her chest when the news reached Lavender Cottage. "It always brings disaster. Poor Lord Ashworth, those horses were his pride and joy." Miss Marple merely knitted on, her expression unreadable. "And what does the stable-master say, Mabel?" "Old Jenkins is a careful man, if I recall." "Oh, he's in a dreadful way at the cottage hospital," Mabel replied, "but he insists he was meticulous. He swears all lanterns were properly extinguished and put away. He's quite beside himself, blaming himself, of course, but he can't understand how it happened." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided a short constitutional would do her good. She strolled towards the edge of the village, her path taking her past the charred remains of the Ashworth stables. A acrid smell still hung in the air, a stark contrast to the fresh spring scent of the surrounding fields. The scene was cordoned off, but a few curious villagers lingered, their hushed conversations punctuated by the occasional clatter of debris as workmen cleared the site. She watched, unnoticed, as Lord Ashworth, his face grim and unusually pale, surveyed the wreckage. He was accompanied by Mr. Thorne, who seemed to be offering quiet words of counsel, and Inspector Davies from the local constabulary, a burly man with a no-nonsense air. Miss Marple observed Mr. Thorne's demeanor. He was solicitous towards his uncle, but his eyes, when he thought no one was looking, held a strange, almost calculating light. As the inspector concluded his inspection and spoke briefly with Lord Ashworth, Miss Marple overheard a fragment of their conversation. "No signs of forced entry, sir," Inspector Davies rumbled. "Looks like a terrible accident, just as the stable lad says. Careless of him to leave that lamp near the hay." Lord Ashworth merely nodded, his shoulders slumped. "Damn the boy, and damn that necklace. I told Amelia it was trouble." Mr. Thorne, however, interjected smoothly. "It's a great tragedy, Uncle, but perhaps we should focus on rebuilding and moving forward. Such things happen, unfortunately. And as for the necklace, well, it's merely a coincidence, surely." His tone was reassuring, almost too reassuring. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A faulty lantern, they said. A young groom, blamed. But she recalled old Jenkins's reputation for meticulousness, and she remembered the small, deliberate movement of Mr. Thorne's foot that had caused the sherry decanter to fall. Coincidence, as Mr. Thorne suggested, was a word that often masked design. The fire was no accident, she felt certain. Someone had wanted those horses gone, and the blame to fall elsewhere. But why? And how was it connected to the emerald necklace, if not by magic, then by something far more tangible and malicious? The scent of smoke and burnt timber seemed to deepen the mystery, a new and far more dangerous layer added to the curse. Chapter 4. A Shadow of the Past. The stable fire cast a long, grim shadow over Atherton. The initial shock soon gave way to morbid speculation, particularly regarding the necklace. Villagers recounted tales of past misfortunes associated with the Serpent's eye with renewed vigor. Miss Marple, during her quiet afternoons with Mabel, found herself piecing together these fragments of local history, much as she might assemble a patchwork quilt. "It all started with Lady Ashworth's great-grandmother, you know," Mabel recounted. "One afternoon her voice hushed. The necklace was acquired by her husband, Sir Reginald Ashworth, a flamboyant sort from some dubious Eastern potentate, or so the story goes. Shortly after he presented it to her, she fell ill with a wasting sickness and died within the year. They say she pined away from fear of the necklace, but the doctors called it consumption." "And then?" Miss Marple prompted, her fingers never faltering with her knitting. "Then it passed to their daughter, Lady Beatrice, She was to marry into a very old, very wealthy family. The necklace was meant to be part of her trousseau. But just weeks before the wedding, her fiancé, a dashing young officer, was killed in a freak riding accident. A broken neck. Lady Beatrice, they say, never recovered, and she became a recluse. The wedding was called off, and the family fortune, which had been tied up in the marriage settlement, suffered a severe blow. Miss Marple hummed thoughtfully. So, a sickness, a death, and a financial setback, a rather consistent pattern of misfortune. "Oh, it gets worse," Mabel continued, her eyes wide. The necklace was then put away for decades, but when Lady Ashworth's father, Sir Alister, inherited it, he was determined to break the curse. He brought it out and insisted his wife, Lady Eleanor, Lady Ashworth's mother, you see, wear it to a grand ball. That very night, Sir Alister's most trusted business partner, a man named Mr. Finch, absconded with a vast sum of the Ashworth family's money, leaving them almost ruined. Sir Alister himself died of a sudden apoplectic fit a few months later, some say from the shock and shame. Miss Marple paused, her needles still. A business partner absconding with funds? That sounds less like a curse and more like a deliberate act of theft. Well, yes, but it happened right after the necklace was brought out, Mabel insisted. It's the timing that's so uncanny, isn't it? After that, the necklace was locked away again in the family strongroom, and the Ashworths rebuilt their fortune very slowly. Until now, of course. Lady Ashworth. She's brought it out to prove a point, I suppose, to show she's not superstitious. Miss Marple digested this information. Consumption, a riding accident, an absconding business partner, an apoplectic fit, blighted roses, a broken arm, a dead peacock, a shattered decanter, and now a stable fire with 2 dead horses and a badly burned stable master. The pattern, when viewed through the lens of human behavior rather than supernatural intervention, began to shift. The incidents were disparate, yet their common thread was their detrimental effect on the Ashworth family. She recalled the conversation she had overheard after the stable fire, Lord Ashworth blaming the necklace, and Mr. Thorne's too quick dismissal of the curse as mere coincidence. It was always easier to blame a supernatural entity than to confront human malice. And in a village, a good story, especially one involving a curse, was far more entertaining than the gritty reality of crime. Later that day, Miss Marple made an excuse to call upon old Mrs. Elphinstone, a venerable resident who lived in a tiny cottage filled with the scent of lavender and old lace. Mrs. Elphinstone, a woman of 90-odd years, possessed a memory as sharp as flint. "The Ashworths and their bauble," she rasped, her eyes though watery, holding a spark of ancient wisdom. "Always trouble with that thing. My grandmother worked for the first Lady Ashworth, saw it all. My mother, too, she was there when Sir Alister's partner ran off. Mr. Finch, a very smooth-tongued man he was, always talking about his investments, always looking for a way to get rich quick. And then he was gone, and the Ashworths were in despair. But he wasn't alone, you know. He had an accomplice, a younger man, his clerk, never caught either of them." "An accomplice?" Miss Marple asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Oh, yes, a quiet sort, the clerk. But my mother said he had a hungry look in his eyes. He disappeared the same night as Finch." "Funny thing, though," Mrs. Elphinstone mused, her gaze distant. "I always thought that young man looked a bit like— well, no matter. Old women's fancies." She shook her head, dismissing the thought. But Miss Marple's mind had already leapt ahead. An absconding business partner, an accomplice, a hungry look. And now a series of misfortunes plaguing the current Ashworth generation. Could the past be echoing in the present? Was the necklace not a magnet for curses, but rather a catalyst for a long, simmering plan, perhaps even a generational vendetta? The thought sent a faint chill down Miss Marple's spine. The true curse, she suspected, lay not in the shimmering emeralds, but in the relentless, enduring nature of human avarice and revenge. The identity of the accomplice and the hungry look would be crucial. Chapter 5. A Deeper Misfortune. The news of the stable fire, initially viewed through the lens of the curse, soon took a more sinister turn. Old Jenkins, the stable-master, succumbed to his injuries in the cottage hospital 3 days later. His death, officially attributed to complications from his burns, solidified the villagers' belief in the necklace's malevolent power. The talk in Atherton was now less about ill luck and more about tragedy, even murder, albeit by supernatural means. Miss Marple, however, remained steadfast in her conviction that the supernatural was merely a convenient veil. Old Jenkins's death weighed heavily on her, a careful man, meticulous in his duties, reduced to a tragic victim of an accident. She had observed the interplay of personalities at Ashworth Manor, and a pattern, though still nebulous, was beginning to form. Her intuition, a finely tuned instrument, honed by years of observing human folly and vice in St. Mary Mead, now pointed towards a more direct and intentional act. She recalled Mr. Thorne's subtle trip of the footman, a seemingly trivial act that could have had a more serious outcome. She remembered his too quick dismissal of the curse after the stable fire. Mabel, still recovering, found solace in discussing the unfolding drama. "Poor old Jenkins," she lamented, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "He was such a faithful servant to the Ashworths. It's a terrible loss. And Lady Ashworth, she's quite distraught apparently, though I hear Lord Ashworth is more concerned about finding new hunters for the county show." "And young Master Julian?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "How has he taken it?" "Oh, Julian," Mabel sighed. "He's been very quiet. He adored those horses, you know. He's usually so boisterous, but he's gone very withdrawn. And Miss Eleanor, she's taken to her bed with a dreadful case of the vapors. Says she can feel the curse's presence in the house." Miss Marple decided it was time for a more direct observation. She had heard that Lady Ashworth, despite her grief, was determined to continue her usual routine. The next afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the village church, ostensibly to admire the stained glass windows, knowing that Lady Ashworth often took a constitutional walk through the churchyard. As anticipated, she saw Lady Ashworth dressed in sober black, walking slowly among the gravestones, accompanied by Miss Penelope Davies, her companion. Miss Davies was holding Lady Ashworth's arm, offering gentle words of comfort. The emerald necklace, surprisingly, was not present. Miss Marple assumed it had been put away out of respect, or perhaps fear. Miss Marple positioned herself near the old yew tree, seemingly absorbed in identifying a particularly tenacious patch of groundsel. As the two women passed, Miss Marple caught snippets of their conversation. "Such a burden, Penelope," Lady Ashworth was saying, her voice strained. "These endless misfortunes. And Lord Ashworth, so consumed with his hunting, barely acknowledges the true cost. It's Julian I worry about most. He's so fragile beneath that bravado." "He'll recover, Lady Ashworth," Miss Davies soothed. "He's strong, and perhaps it would be best if the necklace were put away for good, just until things settle." Lady Ashworth snorted. "And let the villagers think I've succumbed to their idiotic superstitions? Never. It's a family heirloom, Penelope. Besides, it's not as if it has any real value now, is it? Not after what happened with my father's investments." Miss Marple's ears perked up. "No real value now?" That was a curious statement for such a magnificent piece of jewelry, supposedly worth a king's ransom. She remembered Mabel's account of Sir Alister's ruined fortune, and old Mrs. Elphinstone's recollection of Mr. Finch and his accomplice. Could the necklace's true value be far less than its perceived worth, perhaps having been swapped or diminished, somehow over the years? As Lady Ashworth and Miss Davies walked further, Miss Marple noticed a peculiar detail. Miss Davies, though outwardly composed and supportive, gave a quick, almost imperceptible glance over her shoulder. Her eyes, for a fleeting moment, landed not on Miss Marple, but on the gravestone of Sir Alister Ashworth, Lady Ashworth's father. A subtle yet powerful gesture. Why would the companion, a relative newcomer to the household, cast such a specific glance at the grave of a man who died decades ago, a man she likely never knew? The pieces were beginning to align in Miss Marple's mind. The curse was a smokescreen. The tragedies, from the trivial to the fatal, were orchestrated, and the key, she now suspected, lay not in the emeralds themselves, but in their perceived value and the legacy of the past. The look in Miss Davis's eyes, coupled with Lady Ashworth's comment about the necklace's value, suggested a hidden motive that entwined both history and present circumstances. The net was tightening around a truth far more complex than simple. Village gossip. Chapter 6. Observing the household. The comment about the necklace having no real value now reverberated in Miss Marple's mind. It seemed incongruous with the opulence of the piece and the Ashworth family's general display of wealth. This, coupled with Miss Davies's curious glance at Sir Alister's grave, led Miss Marple to believe that the key to the current misfortunes lay in the tangled web of the Ashworth family's financial history, perhaps stemming from that old scandal involving Mr. Finch. Determined to gain closer access to the manor, Miss Marple fabricated a reason to call. She had remembered a rare variety of hellebore that grew wild in the Ashworth woods, an herb she knew would be beneficial for Mabel's lingering cough. Lady Ashworth, ever keen to display her hospitality and perhaps her continued defiance of the curse, graciously extended an invitation for tea the following afternoon. Upon arrival, Miss Marple was shown into the vast drawing-room, where Lady Ashworth sat stiffly, the emerald necklace once again glittering ostentatiously around her neck. Miss Eleanor, looking fragile, was attempting to embroider a piece of tapestry, while Mr. Thorne meticulously sorted through a pile of estate documents at a nearby desk. Julian, his arm still in a sling, was nowhere to be seen, nor was Miss Davies. "My dear Miss Marple," Lady Ashworth declared, her voice a little too loud, "how kind of you to call. I trust Mabel is improving?" "Indeed, Lady Ashworth, she is much better. Your hellebores, I recall, were particularly potent." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "Such a magnificent necklace," she added, her eyes fixed on the emeralds. "It truly is a statement piece. One might even call it priceless." Lady Ashworth gave a dry laugh. "Priceless, perhaps, in sentiment, but its monetary value, alas, is rather diminished. A sad tale from my father's time." She glanced pointedly at Mr. Thorne. "Cedric is doing his best to unravel the various complexities of our family's finances. A Herculean task, I assure you." Mr. Thorne merely offered a polite, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes remaining fixed on his ledgers. Miss Marple noted his carefully controlled demeanor, the almost too perfect calm. She observed Miss Eleanor, who seemed to flinch slightly at the mention of her grandfather's financial woes, her needle pausing mid-stitch. After a few minutes, Miss Davies entered, bearing a tray of delicate sandwiches and cakes. Her presence brought a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Lady Ashworth seemed to relax slightly, and Miss Eleanor offered her a wan smile. Miss Marple, however, noticed the slight tension in Miss Davies's shoulders, a weariness around her, eyes that spoke of more than just the duties of a companion. "Penelope, dear, perhaps you could show Miss Marple the gardens after tea?" Lady Ashworth suggested, her tone bordering on a command. "She's expressed an interest in our hellebores." "Of course, Lady Ashworth," Miss Davies replied, her voice soft. She offered Miss Marple a genuine, if somewhat forced, smile. As they walked through the manicured lawns and past the meticulously maintained flower beds, Miss Davies seemed to loosen slightly. "It's all rather grand, isn't it?" she remarked, gesturing vaguely towards the sprawling manor. "A lot of history, a lot of expectations." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes scanning the grounds. noting a freshly dug patch of earth near. The edge of the woods, larger than a typical gardening bed, and a great deal of responsibility, I imagine. More than you know, Miss Davies said quietly. Almost to herself, she stopped by a particularly vibrant rose bush. Lady Ashworth is a strong woman, but these recent events have taken their toll. The fire, poor old Jenkins, it's been dreadful. And the necklace, Miss Marple prompted softly. The serpent's eye. It truly does seem to attract trouble. Miss Davies shivered despite the mild air. It does. I confess I sometimes wish it would simply disappear. It causes so much anxiety, especially for Miss Eleanor. She's terribly sensitive to atmospheres, she lowered her voice conspiratorially. And Lady Ashworth's comment about its diminished value, well, it's true, or at least it's what she's been told. Mr. Thorne has been quite insistent on that point, citing old ledgers and legal documents related to the Finch scandal. He says most of the emeralds were either fake or swapped for paste many years ago to cover the family's debts after the fraud. Only the setting is truly old. Miss Marple's heart gave a little flutter. Fake? Or swapped for paste? This was a significant revelation. It explained Lady Ashworth's peculiar remark. But if the necklace was largely worthless, why the curse? Why the accidents? The fire? The death? Was it to protect the secret of its diminished value? Or to make it seem like a powerful cursed object that no one would dare touch? Mr. Thorne has been poring over the old papers for months, Miss Davies continued, her voice hushed. He's very dedicated to the family's financial recovery. He even found some old plans for a new wing of the house that Sir Alistair had intended to build, which would require a significant capital injection now. He's always at it, trying to find ways to restore the Ashworth fortune. Miss Marple looked at Miss Davies. Her eyes held a deep sadness, a hint of something unsaid. "You seem troubled, Miss Davies," she observed gently. Miss Davies looked away, her gaze falling on the newly dug patch near the woods that Miss Marple had noticed earlier. "There are some things, Miss Marple, that are best left buried, but sometimes they refuse to stay down." Her voice was barely a whisper. The implication was clear. The past was not just echoing, it was actively reaching out. And the information about the necklace's true value, revealed by Mr. Thorne, was a potent weapon, regardless of its accuracy. What, Miss Marple wondered, was truly buried at Ashworth Manor? And what was Mr. Thorne truly seeking to restore? Chapter 7. Unraveling Motives. The revelation about the necklace's supposed diminished value, coupled with Miss Davies's cryptic remark about things best left buried, provided Miss Marple with a crucial new lens through which to view the unfolding events. If the emeralds were mostly paste, then the entire curse narrative, with its escalating misfortunes, took on a chillingly deliberate quality. The motive for the incidents would not be to steal the necklace for its inherent worth, but for something far more complex, perhaps tied to control, inheritance, or a deeply hidden secret. Miss Marple spent the next few days in quiet contemplation, observing the rhythms of village life, but her mind was constantly sifting through the details of the Ashworth household. She noted Julian's increasingly withdrawn nature, Eleanor's almost constant state of nervous agitation, and Lord Ashworth's preoccupation with his horses and the upcoming county show, seemingly oblivious to the emotional turmoil around him. Lady Ashworth, despite her public defiance, seemed increasingly brittle, her grand pronouncements masking a growing fear. And Mr. Thorne, ever efficient and composed, was a silent, watchful presence, always close at hand. Her thoughts kept returning to the fire and old Jenkins's death. A faulty lantern, they said. But old Jenkins was meticulous. Could the fire have been started to cover something else up? And the new wing plans that Miss Davies mentioned, requiring significant capital. Where would that money come from, especially if the family fortune was as precarious as Mr. Thorne implied. One afternoon, while purchasing a length of ribbon at the draper's, Miss Marple overheard a snippet of conversation between two elderly village women. "Did you hear," one whispered to the other, "that the Ashworths are thinking of selling off a good portion of the East Wood? For timber, they say. It's been in the family for generations. A rare thing for them to part with land." The East Wood. Miss Marple remembered the freshly dug patch of earth she had seen near the woods during her visit to the Manor. It wasn't just a garden bed. It was too large, too recently disturbed. And Miss Davy's comment, "There are some things that are best left buried." The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with an unnerving precision. Later that evening, while sipping cocoa with Mabel, Miss Marple posed a seemingly innocuous question. "Mabel, do you recall what old Mrs. Elphinstone said about Mr. Finch's accomplice, the clerk with the hungry look?" Mabel pondered for a moment. "Oh, yes, she said he looked a bit like—" Well, she couldn't quite place it. But she hinted it was someone from a respectable family, just a bit down on their luck back then. Miss Marple nodded. "And what about the Ashworth family tree? Are there any connections to the Finch family, however distant?" "Goodness, Jane, I couldn't say offhand," Mabel replied, surprised by the directness of the question. "Why ever would you ask?" "Just idle curiosity, dear," Miss Marple demurred, though her mind was working at a furious pace. If Mr. Finch had an accomplice, and if that accomplice had a hungry look, and if there was a family connection, however remote, then a motive for long-term revenge, or perhaps a claim on the Ashworth fortune, began to emerge. The following morning Miss Marple made her way to the village church again, this time to visit the vicar. Father Michael, a kindly, scholarly man, was often a fount of information, particularly on local genealogies. She explained her interest as a family history project for Mabel. Father Michael, flattered, brought out the ancient parish registers. Patiently, Miss Marple traced the tangled branches of the Ashworth family. It was a tedious process, but then she found it. A marriage, 3 generations back, between a minor branch of the Ashworths and a family named Thorne. The name jolted her. Mr. Cedric Thorne. Lord Ashworth's nephew, the distant cousin, the man who was meticulously sorting through the estate documents, the man who had subtly tripped the footman, who had dismissed the curse too quickly, and who had declared the emerald necklace was of diminished value. And then another entry, far less formal, scrawled in an old baptismal record, "Henry Finch, son of Tobias Finch, visitor, and unnamed mother," followed by a later, fainter notation. Finch family had a reputation for unscrupulous dealings, associated with the Thorne family in several business ventures. The pieces converged, the Finch who absconded with funds, and his accomplice. The Papahori, Thorne family, distant relatives of the Ashworths, connected to the Finch family. Mr. Cedric Thorne, now residing at Ashworth Manor, carefully managing the estate and declaring the necklace largely worthless. The plot, Miss Marple realized, was far more intricate than anyone in Atherton could imagine. It wasn't a curse or even a simple theft. It was a long game, a meticulously planned scheme of revenge and financial manipulation spanning generations. The stable fire, old Jenkins's death, even the minor accidents, they were all carefully placed pieces in a grand design. The freshly dug patch in the East Wood, the plans for a new wing, the sale of land, it all pointed to an elaborate effort to gain control of the Ashworth assets. Mr. Thorne wasn't just managing the estate, he was orchestrating its future, perhaps even reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his family's through a web of deceit and engineered misfortune. The very human motives of greed and a desire for retribution passed down through the generations were far more terrifying than any supernatural curse. Chapter 8. The Net Tightens. The connection between the Thorne and Finch families, coupled with Cedric Thorne's presence and actions at Ashworth Manor, solidified Miss Marple's suspicions. The curse was a brilliant smokescreen designed to mask a carefully executed plan of financial manipulation and, increasingly, violence. The goal, she now surmised, was not just to inherit, but perhaps to reclaim what was lost generations ago, and to profit handsomely in the process. Miss Marple began to observe Cedric Thorne with a renewed intensity, though always maintaining her innocent, knitting-averse demeanor. She noticed his quiet conversations with Lady Ashworth about the necessity of selling off certain assets to stabilize the estate, particularly the East Wood, which he argued was an unproductive drain on resources. She saw him gently, almost imperceptibly, undermine Julian's attempts to take a more active role in the estate's management, always with a plausible excuse of Julian's inexperience or his recent injury. And she saw him subtly encourage Eleanor's nervous disposition, feeding her fears about the curse, thus keeping her distracted and malleable. The narrative of the necklace's worthlessness, which Miss Davies had innocently shared, was now a crucial component of the deception. If the family believed the heirloom was paste, they would be less likely to guard it closely, and perhaps even eager to be rid of it. But Miss Marple suspected the necklace's true value might be far higher than Thorne claimed. She recalled the freshly dug earth in the East Wood, and Miss Davies's whispered comment, "There are some things that are best left buried." What if something had been buried there? Something of immense value, hidden for generations, perhaps the very fortune Mr. Finch had absconded with, or evidence of it, or even the real emeralds, swapped out for the paste ones Mr. Thorne now claimed comprised the necklace? The East Wood was being sold for timber, conveniently allowing access to excavate without undue suspicion. Miss Marple decided a little gardening was in order. She enlisted Mabel, whose health was improving, to suggest a pleasant afternoon stroll to Lady Ashworth, to admire some rare wildflowers said to bloom in the East Wood. Lady Ashworth, ever keen to maintain appearances, agreed. Accompanied by Miss Davies, the three women made their way towards the wood. Cedric Thorne, as if by coincidence, was also present, overseeing a group of timber workers. He offered polite greetings, but seemed ill at ease with their presence. As Lady Ashworth and Mabel discussed Flora, Miss Marple steered Miss Davies towards the patch of disturbed earth she had previously noted. "My dear Miss Davies," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle, "I am so intrigued by the history of these woods. Do you know, I heard that the old Ashworth family used to bury their most treasured possessions here, perhaps to protect them during times of unrest?" Miss Davies' eyes widened, and she cast a nervous glance at Cedric Thorne, who was just out of earshot. I wouldn't know, Miss Marple. Mr. Thorne hasn't mentioned anything of the sort." "No, I dare say not," Miss Marple replied, her gaze fixing on a small, barely visible indentation in the ground, almost hidden by encroaching weeds. It looked like a very old, almost completely decayed piece of twine or rope, partially exposed. She subtly nudged it with her foot, drawing it out a fraction further. It seemed to lead deeper into the earth. But one hears such fascinating stories in the village. Old Mrs. Elphinstone, she has a wonderful memory for these things. At that precise moment, a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the wood. A large branch, seemingly healthy, plummeted from an ancient oak tree, landing with a terrifying thud just inches from where Miss Eleanor had been standing moments before, admiring a bluebell. Eleanor shrieked, clutching her chest, and crumpled to the ground in a dead faint. "The curse!" Lady Ashworth cried, her face ashen. "The necklace! It's following us!" Cedric Thorne rushed forward, his face a mask of concern, immediately tending to Eleanor. "It's just a coincidence, Aunt. A rotten branch. She's merely oversensitive." He shot a quick, almost imperceptible glance towards the spot where Miss Marple stood, near the exposed twine. His eyes held a flash of something akin to frustration, a momentary break in his composed facade. But Miss Marple's attention was not solely on the fallen branch. She had observed its trajectory, the way it had broken. It was indeed a rotten branch, but it looked as though it had been deliberately weakened, perhaps sawn almost through, awaiting a strong gust of wind or the subtle tension of the tree. The curse was growing more audacious, more dangerous, and Cedric Thorne's reaction, the flicker of frustration in his eyes, suggested that this accident had not gone entirely to plan. It was meant to scare, perhaps even harm, but not quite in this haphazard way. The near miss, the exposed twine, and Thorne's unguarded expression provided Miss Marple with crucial pieces. The curse was now a direct threat, its orchestrator becoming increasingly desperate, and the truth, she sensed, was literally buried beneath their feet, waiting to be unearthed. Chapter 9. The Gathering for the Revelation. Eleanor, thankfully, recovered quickly from her faint, though the incident left her more fragile than ever. The village buzzed with renewed talk of the curse, the fallen branch seen as yet another undeniable sign of the necklace's malevolence. Miss Marple, however, saw it as a desperate act by a perpetrator whose carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel. The slight frustration in Cedric Thorne's eyes, the precarious way the branch was poised, it indicated an escalating and less controlled series of actions. She knew she had enough pieces to form a coherent picture, but she needed to present it in a way that would be understood and, more importantly, accepted by the villagers and, crucially, by the Ashworths themselves. Blaming a human perpetrator, especially one so seemingly upstanding as Cedric Thorne, would be met with disbelief unless the evidence was irrefutable and presented with the gentle, logical precision that was Miss Marple's hallmark. The opportunity arose, as it often does in villages, through a simple social event. Lady Ashworth, ever determined to show her resilience, announced a small tea party for a select group of local ladies. Miss Marple, of course, received an invitation, as did Miss Davies. The day of the tea party was grey and overcast, the sort of weather that seemed to amplify the hushed, nervous atmosphere within Ashworth Manor. Lady Ashworth, unusually subdued, presided over the tea service, the emerald necklace once again glittering around her neck, almost daring fate. Eleanor sat by the window, her embroidery untouched, her eyes darting nervously towards the necklace. Julian was absent, having gone to the next town, his mother explained, to look at a new horse. Cedric Thorne was present as always, hovering solicitously, offering to refill cups and fetch more biscuits. Miss Marple, as she stirred her tea, began to speak, her voice, soft but clear, carrying easily across the room. Such a beautiful necklace. Lady Ashworth, I was just remarking to Mabel the other day how it reminds me of a rather curious situation that occurred in St. Mary Mead some years ago. A family heirloom, you see, a beautiful painting, was supposedly cursed. Every time it was displayed, something unfortunate would happen to the family. A valuable vase broken, a pet falling ill, even a minor accident with a carriage. Lady Ashworth leaned forward, her interest piqued. "Indeed, Miss Marple, and what became of this curse?" "Ah, well," Miss Marple continued, her eyes twinkling slightly as she met Cedric Thorne's gaze, which had sharpened imperceptibly. "It turned out the curse was nothing more than an elaborate deception. The painting itself was worthless, a clever forgery. But the frame, you see, a very old and ornate one, had a hidden compartment. And within that compartment the original owner had hidden a will, one that disinherited the current family and bequeathed everything to a long-lost relative, a relative who had a great deal to gain by making the family believe the painting was cursed and keeping them from ever inspecting it too closely." Cedric Thorne, who had been about to offer a plate of shortbread, paused, his hand hovering. Eleanor gasped softly. Lady Ashworth looked bewildered. "The perpetrator," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle, "was a trusted family member, someone who had access to the house and who knew the family's superstitions. He carefully orchestrated the accidents. All was minor enough not to arouse too much suspicion, but enough to build the legend of the curse. He even spread rumors about the painting's reduced value to ensure no one would think to steal it and thus discover the hidden will. His aim was to eventually discover the will himself once the family was sufficiently disoriented and claim his inheritance. "But what about the more serious incidents?" Lady Ashworth asked, her voice trembling. "The fire? Poor Jenkins?" "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said, her gaze now direct on Cedric Thorne, though her expression remained benevolent. "In the St. Mary Mead case, the perpetrator became increasingly desperate when his plans were taking too long. He escalated the incidents, hoping to speed things along, and sometimes," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "he even manufactured more serious accidents to remove those who might otherwise uncover his scheme or who stood in his way. He even attempted to destroy certain documents that would reveal the truth about the true value of the original painting." Cedric Thorne's teacup clattered softly against its saucer. His face, usually so composed, had paled. He cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, that is a rather outlandish tale, and I fail to see its relevance here." "Oh, but it is relevant, Mr. Thorne," Miss Marple said, her eyes, though mild, holding the steady glint of truth. "Because in the case of the emerald necklace, the deception is not about a hidden will in a painting frame, but about a far more tangible treasure. The necklace, you see, is not mostly paste, as has been so carefully suggested. The precious emeralds and the true fortune of the Ashworth family were not lost in the Finch scandal. They were buried, deliberately, hidden for generations by the original accomplice, a man named Thorne, who worked with Mr. Finch. A man whose descendants, I have no doubt, would believe they had a rightful claim to it." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Eleanor was openly weeping now, and Lady Ashworth looked utterly stunned. "And those misfortunes, from the blighted roses to poor old Jenkins's death," Miss Marple concluded, her voice unwavering, "were not the work of a curse, but the calculated actions of someone determined to both divert suspicion from the true value of the necklace and to clear the way for their own inheritance, by creating chaos and fear, even by removing those who stood too close to the truth. Someone who knew the family secrets and sought to reclaim what they believed was lost, even if it meant destroying lives and reputations along the way. Someone who has been carefully orchestrating the curse to facilitate the digging up of the true treasure and the selling off of land to cover their tracks." The room was utterly silent. All eyes were on Cedric Thorne, whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled, revealing a flicker of raw panic and chilling calculation in his eyes. The net had tightened, and Miss Marple, with the gentle precision of a master weaver, had revealed the pattern of the human hand behind the supposed curse. The quiet revelation hung in the air, a truth far more unsettling than any ghost story. Chapter 10. The Truth Revealed and Aftermath. The silence in Ashworth Manor's drawing-room was palpable, thick with the weight of Miss Marple's gentle but devastating accusation. Cedric Thorne stood frozen, his teacup still clattering against its saucer, his usual composure utterly shattered. Lady Ashworth, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror, looked from Miss Marple to her nephew, her emerald necklace now seeming to mock her with its cold, hard gleam. Eleanor continued to sob, clutching her embroidery like a shield. "This is preposterous," Thorne finally managed, his voice hoarse, though lacking its usual confident ring. "You have no proof, Miss Marple. These are wild accusations." "Proof, Mr. Thorne?" Miss Marple countered, her voice still calm, almost serene. "The proof lies in your actions, and in the patterns of human nature, which, I assure you, are far more predictable than any curse. You came here, a distant relative, and quickly took control of the Ashworth finances. You propagated the story that the necklace was largely worthless, based on your discovery of old papers, I suspect, you yourself fabricated or misinterpreted. This made the family less vigilant about the necklace, even as you orchestrated a series of cursed events to keep them distracted and afraid. She continued, her gaze unwavering. The blighted roses were likely treated with a common herbicide easily acquired. Julian's fall was a staged accident, perhaps a loosened stirrup, or a sudden fright to his horse. The dead peacock, the shattered decanter, minor incidents, yes, but building the narrative. And the stable fire, which tragically killed old Jenkins, was no accident either. Old Jenkins was a meticulous man. He would have noticed if the true emeralds had been swapped for paste in the strong room, or if someone was digging where they shouldn't be. He was a potential witness, a loose end, and thus, sadly, had to be removed. "You speak of digging, Miss Marple," Thorne sneered, attempting a bravado he no longer possessed. "What nonsense is this?" "The freshly dug earth in the east wood, mister." "Thorne," Miss Marple stated, her voice quiet but firm, "you've been selling off portions of it, claiming it's for timber, but your true purpose was to excavate. I believe you were not only looking for the fortune Mr. Finch and your ancestor, Mr. Thorne, absconded with, but also for the real emerald necklace, swapped out for paste generations ago when the original fraud occurred. The rope, barely buried near the surface, was a marker. You had almost found it, hadn't you? That falling branch was meant to scare us away from that spot, but it merely proved your increasing desperation." Lady Ashworth finally found her voice, a raw, anguished cry. "Cedric, is this true? The necklace, the fortune?" "He also presented plans for a new wing, Lady Ashworth," Miss Marple added gently, "which would require significant capital he would find when he eventually discovered the buried treasure, thus becoming the family's savior, and securing his control over the estate and its true immense wealth." At that moment the drawing-room doors burst open, and Inspector Davies, accompanied by 2 constables, entered. He looked directly at Cedric Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, we have received some rather compelling information regarding irregularities in the Ashworth estate accounts, and a number of disturbing details about the stable fire. We also have a warrant to search the East Wood, based on an anonymous tip about suspicious digging activity." Cedric Thorne looked from Miss Marple to the inspector, his face draining of all color. The game was truly up. The carefully constructed edifice of his scheme collapsed under the weight of Miss Marple's quiet logic and the impending police investigation. He knew then that his curse had been thoroughly unmasked. In the